The things people throw away often tell the truth better than the things they keep. Every Thursday morning for nearly 10 years, a transport truck rolled through the gates of Walker Engine Repair, carrying another load of broken engines. Some arrived covered in dust, others arrived partially disassembled. Many came with tags that simply read, "Beyond Repair." The drivers joked about them. The warehouse workers laughed about them. Even the managers who signed the paperwork treated the deliveries like routine trash disposal. Only one person seemed genuinely interested every single time: Ethan Walker. On this particular Thursday, the truck arrived just after sunrise. Ethan stood outside his small garage, wearing faded work gloves and a denim jacket as the driver lowered another crate onto the concrete. The garage itself was nothing impressive. 2 service bays, a modest office, a gravel parking lot that needed attention every spring. Yet somehow it had survived economic downturns, supply shortages, rising costs, and every challenge that had forced larger competitors to close their doors. The driver climbed down from the truck and handed Ethan a clipboard. "Another batch from Hayes Power Systems," he said. Ethan signed without looking surprised. "Looks heavier than usual." The driver laughed. "You are the only guy I know who gets excited about broken engines." Ethan glanced toward the crate. "Maybe." The driver shook his head and drove away. A few minutes later, Ethan's 10-year-old daughter Sophie arrived, carrying a backpack almost as large as she was. She stopped beside the crate and looked at the shipping labels.
"More engines?"
Ethan nodded.
"Looks like it."
Sophie smiled.
"From the same company?"
"Same company."
She looked at the growing collection of engines stored throughout the property. Some sat on shelves, some rested on work stands. Others occupied corners of storage areas behind the garage. Over the years, hundreds had passed through the shop. Hundreds more remained. Sophie had stopped counting long ago. "Most people would throw them away," she said. Ethan removed the lid from the crate.
"Most people do."
Sophie watched him examine the first engine. He moved slowly, carefully, like someone reading a book instead of inspecting machinery. His eyes traveled across every component, every connection, every mark. Then he pulled a small notebook from his pocket and wrote something down.
Sophie noticed immediately. She always did.
"You wrote another note?"
Ethan nodded. "Just an observation."
"You make a lot of observations."
A faint smile appeared on his face.
"Sometimes observations become useful." Sophie had heard versions of that answer for years. Every engine seemed to generate another note, another sketch, another page filled with measurements and comments. Yet Ethan never explained exactly what he was looking for. Later that afternoon, nearly 70 miles away, Victoria Hayes sat inside the executive conference room of Hayes Power Systems, reviewing quarterly reports. Large screens displayed sales figures, expansion plans, and production targets. The company had become one of the largest engine manufacturers in the region. Investors were happy. Revenue continued growing.
New facilities were under construction. Success seemed almost routine. During the meeting, one operations manager mentioned disposal costs associated with defective engines. Victoria barely looked up from her tablet. "Still sending them to that independent garage?" she asked. "Walker Engine Repair?" the manager replied. "Yes," Victoria nodded. "Good. It is cheaper than expanding storage." The conversation moved on immediately. Nobody thought about the engines again. Nobody asked what happened after the trucks left. Nobody wondered why the same garage had accepted every shipment for nearly a decade. Meanwhile, back at the shop, Ethan remained alone in the service bay long after sunset. The newest engine sat partially disassembled beneath bright overhead lights. Tools rested neatly beside it. Sophie had already gone home to finish homework. The garage was silent, except for the occasional sound of turning pages. Ethan was not reading a repair manual. He was reading one of dozens of notebooks stored inside a metal cabinet near the back wall. He compared an entry written 8 years earlier to something he had discovered that morning. Then he compared another, and another. For a long moment, he stared at the pages without moving. Slowly, he reached for a pen and added one more note. Then he looked at the engine and quietly said something nobody else was there to hear. There it is again. The next morning began the same way hundreds of mornings had begun before. Ethan unlocked the garage before sunrise, switched on the lights, and walked past rows of engines that most people considered worthless. To visitors, the collection looked random. Shelves filled with damaged components, storage racks crowded with failed designs, crates stacked in corners. But Ethan never looked at them as scrap. He looked at them as evidence. Sophie arrived before school carrying a notebook of her own. She found her father standing in front of a long wall covered with shelves. "You were out here late again," she said. Ethan smiled slightly. "Could not sleep." Sophie followed his gaze. For years, she had watched him study engines the same way other people studied puzzles. "What did you find?" she asked. Ethan hesitated for a moment. Then he walked toward a cabinet and unlocked it. Sophie rarely saw him open that cabinet. Inside were dozens of worn notebooks arranged by year. Some were thick, others barely half full. Together, they represented nearly a decade of observations. Sophie stared at the collection. "You filled all of those?" Ethan nodded. "Most of them." She pulled one from the shelf and carefully opened it. Every page contained diagrams, measurements, notes, dates, and sketches. Thousands of entries, thousands of hours. "Why keep all this?" she asked quietly. Ethan took the notebook from her hands and flipped to a page written nearly 7 years earlier. Then he opened another written only a few weeks ago. He pointed at both pages. Sophie leaned closer. The same note appeared in both places. Not identical wording, the same issue. The same unusual pattern, years apart. "That cannot be a coincidence," she said. Ethan smiled faintly. "That is what I keep telling myself." Later that afternoon, another shipment arrived from Hayes Power Systems. The driver recognized Ethan immediately. "More broken dreams," he joked while unloading the crate. Ethan signed the paperwork and rolled the newest engine into the service bay. The driver glanced around the property. "You ever think about getting rid of these old things?" He pointed toward the rows of engines. Ethan looked at them for a long moment. "No." "Why not?" Ethan shrugged. "They still have something to teach." The driver laughed and drove away. Across town, Victoria Hayes stood before a group of investors celebrating another successful quarter. Sales continued growing. Production targets had been exceeded. Expansion plans moved ahead of schedule. The atmosphere inside the conference room felt confident. Comfortable. During the presentation, one engineer briefly mentioned recurring warranty concerns appearing in a small percentage of field reports. The slide remained visible for less than 30 seconds before being replaced by stronger sales numbers. Nobody asked additional questions. Nobody seemed concerned. Meanwhile, back at the garage, Ethan carefully disassembled the newest engine. The process took hours. Every component was inspected, every measurement recorded, every unusual detail documented. As evening settled outside, he compared his findings against notes stretching back nearly 10 years. Then he stopped. Not because he was surprised, because he had seen the same thing before. Again and again. and again. Sophie found him later sitting alone at the workbench, staring at a page filled with dates.
"You found it again, did not you?" she asked. Ethan looked up slowly. "Yes." Sophie glanced at the notebooks. "The same problem?" Ethan closed the book and nodded once. Then he looked toward the rows of discarded engines resting quietly throughout the garage. "And if I am right," he said softly, "it is getting worse." Over the following week, the notebooks began taking over the workbench. Ethan pulled records from different years and spread them across every available surface in the garage office. Pages from 3 years ago sat beside pages from 8 years ago. Engine diagrams overlapped with inspection reports. Handwritten notes filled the margins. To anyone else, it looked like chaos. To Ethan, it looked like a conversation that had been unfolding for a decade. Sophie stopped by after school and found him comparing 2 photographs. "You have been staring at those for 20 minutes, she said. Ethan barely looked up. "Probably longer." Sophie set her backpack down and walked closer. "Do they match?" Ethan nodded. "That is the problem." She studied the pictures. Both showed different engines manufactured years apart, different production runs, different model numbers. Yet Ethan had circled the same area on each image. "How can they have the same problem if they are different engines?" she asked. Ethan leaned back in his chair. "That is exactly the question." The next morning, another customer visited the garage for routine service. While waiting, he noticed the shelves filled with old engines. "You know those things are worth more as scrap metal than repair parts," he joked. Ethan smiled politely. "Maybe." The customer laughed. "Then why keep them?" Ethan glanced toward the rows of engines. "Because they keep repeating themselves." The man looked confused. Ethan offered no further explanation. He rarely did. Later that afternoon, he began organizing 10 years of notes into a single timeline. Dates, failures, component wear, production changes. Every piece of information went onto a large board mounted inside the back office. Sophie watched the process quietly. As the board filled, even she could see something unusual emerging. The same pattern appeared again and again across different years, sometimes hidden, sometimes obvious, but always present. "It looks like a trail," she said. Ethan stared at the board. "That is what worries me."
Nearly 70 miles away, Hayes Power Systems announced another major expansion initiative. Victoria Hayes stood before reporters discussing innovation, growth, and future production goals. Industry analysts praised the company. Investors celebrated the announcement. Headlines focused on success. Inside the engineering department, however, a small group of technicians had started noticing an increase in warranty reports. The numbers remained low, not enough to trigger concern, but enough to appear repeatedly in internal discussions. One engineer prepared a report highlighting the trend. The document moved through several departments before disappearing beneath more urgent priorities. Nobody considered it important. Back at the garage, Ethan finally finished assembling the timeline late one evening. The wall stretched nearly 20 feet across the office. Hundreds of notes connected by colored markers and handwritten observations. Sophie stood beside him, studying the result. "So, what does it mean?" she asked. Ethan remained silent for several seconds. Then he walked toward a section near the center of the board and tapped one specific note written almost 9 years earlier. "This was the first time I found it." He moved his finger toward another note from 6 years ago, then another from 3 years ago, then another from the newest engine delivered only days earlier. Sophie followed the path carefully,
Her eyes widened. It never went away. Ethan nodded once. No. It just kept showing up. Yes. Sophie looked at the wall again. Do you think they know? Ethan stared at the timeline stretching across the room. Then he looked toward the newest engine resting quietly inside the service bay. I do not think they are looking for it. The following month became the most successful month in the company's history. Hayes Power Systems expanded production, opened new distribution agreements, and announced another series of ambitious targets. Industry publications praised the leadership team. Investors praised the strategy. Employees celebrated record numbers. From the outside, everything looked stronger than ever. Ethan noticed none of it until a new shipment arrived at the garage. The crate looked ordinary. The paperwork looked ordinary. Even the engine itself appeared almost identical to dozens he had inspected before. Yet something about it made him pause.
He spent nearly an hour examining a single component before reaching for one of his notebooks. Then another. Then a third. By lunchtime, several books lay open across the workbench. Sophie arrived carrying sandwiches and immediately recognized the look on his face. You found something. Ethan nodded slowly. Maybe. Sophie set the food down. That means yes. Ethan smiled faintly. She knew him too well. He turned one of the notebooks toward her. Look at these dates. Sophie studied the entries. The pattern stretched across years, different engine generations, different production cycles, different engineering teams. Yet the same issue appeared repeatedly. Not often enough to attract attention, not severe enough to create immediate concern, just frequent enough to leave a trail. It is still happening, she said. Ethan nodded. More often now. Sophie looked toward the newest engine resting on the stand. Can it be fixed? Ethan leaned back in his chair. Probably. Then why would nobody fix it? Ethan thought about the question for several moments. Because they are solving the symptoms. Sophie frowned. Not the cause? Exactly. Across town, inside a modern conference room overlooking the city, Victoria Hayes reviewed forecasts for the coming year. The projections looked impressive. Revenue growth, market expansion, increased production capacity. Every chart pointed upward. During the meeting, a senior engineer requested a few minutes to discuss recurring technical reports appearing across multiple product lines. The room grew quieter. The engineer displayed several charts showing trends that had gradually increased over time. Not alarming, not yet, but noticeable. Victoria reviewed the information. What is your recommendation? She asked. The engineer hesitated. More investigation. One executive immediately responded. We have reviewed similar concerns before. The failure rate remains within acceptable limits. Several others agreed. The discussion moved on. The charts disappeared from the screen. The meeting continued. Late that evening, Ethan stood alone inside the garage, studying the wall covered with 10 years of observations. He followed the trail again. Year after year, engine after engine. The pattern no longer looked like a coincidence. It looked like a warning. Sophie found him there just before closing time. You are looking at the wall again. Ethan nodded, trying to decide something. What? Ethan stared at the notes stretching across nearly 20 feet of space. Then he looked at the newest entry he had written earlier that day. Whether somebody should know. 2 days later, Ethan made a decision he had postponed for years. He organized a small portion of his findings into a professional report. Not the entire collection,
not the thousands of pages stored inside cabinets and notebooks. Just enough to show the pattern. Dates, component failures, repeated observations, supporting photographs. He spent nearly 12 hours preparing the document. When he finished, the report was only 23 pages long. It represented less than 1% of what he had collected over 10 years.
Sophie found him sealing the envelope.
You are sending it? Ethan nodded. I think I should. Do you think they will listen? Ethan looked at the package for a moment. I do not know. The report arrived at Hayes Power Systems the following week. It passed through receiving, then administration, then engineering review. Eventually, it landed on the desk of a mid-level manager responsible for technical assessments. He skimmed the cover page. An independent garage owner. A collection of observations. 10 years of field notes. The manager reviewed several pages before forwarding the document with a brief recommendation. Further review not necessary. The report never reached Victoria Hayes. It never reached senior engineering leadership. It disappeared into a system designed to process thousands of documents every month.
Back at the garage, Ethan expected nothing. He had sent the report because it felt like the right thing to do, not because he believed it would change anything. A few weeks passed. More shipments arrived. More engines were unloaded. More notes were added to the growing wall inside the office. Yet something had changed. The newest engines were showing the pattern sooner than before. Sophie noticed it first. The dates are getting closer together. Ethan looked toward the wall. She was right. What had once appeared every few years now appeared every few months. The intervals were shrinking. That is not good, is it? She asked. Ethan folded his arms and studied the timeline. No. Meanwhile, Hayes Power Systems continued celebrating success. Production targets increased. Marketing campaigns expanded. Industry publications highlighted the company as a model of innovation. Investors praised leadership decisions. Growth appeared unstoppable. Then, small problems began appearing in public. A transportation company reported unusual maintenance costs. A commercial fleet operator requested additional inspections. Warranty claims increased slightly. Nothing dramatic, nothing alarming, just enough to create quiet conversations among technicians and service departments. Inside company meetings, the reports were discussed briefly before attention shifted elsewhere. The numbers still looked strong. The future still looked bright. One evening, long after closing time, Ethan stood alone in front of the wall of notes. The office lights illuminated 10 years of observations stretching from one side of the room to the other. Sophie entered carrying 2 cups of coffee, one for him, one for herself, mostly milk, with a little coffee added. She handed him the cup and looked at the wall. You tried to tell them. Ethan accepted the drink and nodded. Yes. And they ignored it. He remained quiet for a moment. Then he shrugged. People usually hear what they expect to hear. Sophie followed his gaze toward the newest entries. More dates, more evidence, more warnings. What happens now? She asked. Ethan stared at the timeline that had consumed a decade of his life. Then he looked toward the rows of discarded engines resting silently throughout the garage. Now, he said softly, we wait and see if the pattern finishes telling its story. The first public sign appeared on a Monday morning, then another on Tuesday. By Friday, industry forums, service departments, and commercial fleet operators were all discussing the same issue. Unexpected failures, unusual repair requests, warranty claims arriving faster than normal. None of the incidents were catastrophic on their own. The problem was the pattern. The same pattern Ethan had been documenting for 10 years. Inside Hayes Power Systems, meetings began starting earlier and ending later. Engineers reviewed reports. Analysts compared numbers. Executives requested updates. What had once looked like isolated incidents now appeared connected. Victoria Hayes sat through briefing after briefing as new data arrived from across the country. Every report seemed slightly worse than the one before. "How widespread is it?" she asked during one emergency meeting. A senior analyst hesitated before answering. "We are still determining that." Nobody liked that response, especially Victoria. She had built her career on certainty, on preparation, on having answers before questions became problems. Yet the numbers arriving on her desk refused to cooperate. Across town, life inside Walker Engine Repair remained surprisingly normal. Customers continued arriving, engines continued being repaired. Sophie continued doing homework at the small desk inside the office. The only difference was that Ethan spent more time studying the wall of notes than ever before. One afternoon, Sophie looked up from a math assignment and noticed him comparing several recent reports. "It started, did it not?" she asked. Ethan looked toward the newest entries on the wall. Several fresh notes had been added over the previous week. "I think so." Sophie stared at the timeline. "Exactly where you said it would." Ethan remained quiet. There was no satisfaction in his expression, no feeling of victory, only concern. The same concern he had felt years earlier when he first realized the pattern existed. Later that evening, another transport truck arrived at the garage. The driver stepped out, shaking his head. "You are not going to believe this." Ethan signed the paperwork. "Try me." The driver pointed toward the shipment manifest. 3 times the normal volume. Ethan examined the documents. The numbers were accurate. More failed engines had arrived in 1 week than usually arrived in an entire month. Sophie noticed his expression change slightly. Not surprise, confirmation. The driver looked around at the rows of stored engines. "Looks like business is booming for somebody." Ethan glanced toward the shelves filled with a decade of evidence. "Maybe." That same night, Victoria remained alone inside company headquarters long after most employees had gone home. Reports covered the conference table: warranty data, service records, engineering assessments, customer complaints. For the first time in years, the future no longer looked predictable. Then she noticed something unusual buried inside an older document. An independent technical report submitted months earlier. The source immediately caught her attention: Walker Engine Repair. Victoria opened the file and began reading. The further she progressed, the quieter the room seemed to become. Dates.
Observations. Repeated findings. Supporting evidence. 10 years of history condensed into a warning nobody had taken seriously. She reached the final page and stared at it for a long moment. Then she looked out the window toward the city lights. Somewhere beyond them sat a small garage that had spent a decade receiving engines everyone else wanted to forget. And for the first time, Victoria realized the person who understood the problem best might not be inside her company at all. The next morning, Ethan arrived at the garage before sunrise, as he always did. The parking lot was empty. The air was cool. Nothing about the building suggested that it had become connected to a growing crisis affecting one of the largest engine manufacturers in the region. Yet inside the office, the wall told a different story.
10 years of observation stretched across nearly every available surface, every note, every date, every engine, all connected. Sophie entered carrying breakfast and immediately noticed that her father had not touched the food he left on the desk hours earlier.
You have been here all night again. Ethan looked up from a stack of reports. Not all night. Sophie raised an eyebrow. Almost all night. He smiled faintly. She was probably right. Around mid-morning, a black sedan pulled into the parking lot. Ethan recognized the vehicle immediately, even before the driver stepped out. Victoria Hayes walked toward the office, carrying a folder beneath one arm. She looked professional, as always. Calm. Composed. Yet something about her expression had changed. The certainty was gone. Sophie noticed it too.
Victoria entered the office and stopped when she saw the wall.
For several seconds, she said nothing. Her eyes moved slowly across thousands of notes, photographs, diagrams, and timelines. "This is all from our engines?" she finally asked. Ethan nodded. "Most of it." Victoria took a few more steps forward. "How long?" 10 years. The answer seemed to settle heavily in the room. Victoria looked at the notebooks stacked on shelves. Dozens of them. Some worn from years of use. Others filled recently. "You documented all of this yourself?" Ethan nodded again. "Whenever I found something worth recording." Victoria opened the folder she had brought. Inside were reports, charts, and internal analyses generated by entire departments. Teams of engineers, consultants, analysts.
Yet standing in front of Ethan's wall, the documents suddenly looked incomplete.
I read the report you sent, she said quietly.
Ethan did not appear surprised.
I figured you eventually would.
Victoria glanced toward the timeline.
The pattern started years earlier than we thought.
Yes.
And it spread gradually.
Yes.
She took a deep breath. You knew that before we did.
Ethan looked at the wall.
I had more time with the engines.
The answer sounded simple, but Victoria understood what it really meant. While her company focused on production targets, quarterly reports, and expansion plans, Ethan had been studying the evidence one engine at a time. Not for weeks, not for months, for a decade. Sophie sat quietly in the corner watching the conversation unfold. For years, she had seen her father filling notebooks while everyone else ignored them. Now the person who once treated the shipments as disposal costs stood staring at 10 years of accumulated knowledge. Victoria walked slowly along the wall, stopping repeatedly to examine entries from different years. The same issue appeared again and again. Small changes, growing frequency, increasing impact. The entire story had been there the whole time. "Can you help us understand it?" she finally asked. Ethan looked at the rows of engines visible through the office doorway. Hundreds of discarded machines that nobody else wanted. Then he looked back at Victoria. "I think I can explain what happened." For the first time since arriving, Victoria seemed relieved. Not because the problem was solved, because she had finally found the person who had been listening while everyone else was talking. For the next 3 hours, Victoria remained inside the small office while Ethan walked her through a decade of observations. There were no dramatic presentations, no polished slides, no consultants. Just notebooks, photographs, engine components, and thousands of handwritten notes. Sophie sat quietly nearby, listening, as her father explained what he had discovered. The pattern was not caused by a single defective part. It was the result of several small decisions made over many years. Individually, each decision seemed reasonable. Together, they created a weakness that gradually spread through multiple engine generations. Victoria listened carefully. Occasionally, she asked questions.
Occasionally, she took notes. Most of the time, she simply stared at the evidence covering the wall.
"How did nobody see this?" she finally asked. Ethan looked at the notebooks. People usually find what they are looking for. Victoria nodded slowly. She understood exactly what he meant. Her company had been searching for immediate failures, short-term explanations, quarterly solutions. Ethan had been studying long-term patterns. Neither approach was wrong, but only one revealed the full story. By late afternoon, several members of Hayes Power Systems engineering leadership arrived at the garage. Some appeared skeptical at first. That skepticism disappeared quickly. The wall spoke for itself. 10 years of data, hundreds of engines, thousands of observations. No consultant in the industry possessed a collection like it.
One senior engineer stood silently in front of the timeline for nearly 10 minutes. Finally, he shook his head. We had access to every engine design. He looked toward Ethan. And somehow you still knew more about their failures than we did. Ethan shrugged. I had the advantage. What advantage? The engineer asked. Ethan glanced toward the shelves filled with discarded engines. Nobody was in a hurry. The room became quiet. That answer captured everything. For 10 years, the company had viewed the shipments as waste disposal. Ethan had viewed them as information. One group saw a cost. The other saw a lesson. Later that evening, Victoria walked through the storage areas behind the garage. Row after row of engines stretched across the building. Thousands of hours of accumulated evidence. She stopped beside one shelf and ran her hand across a faded identification tag attached years earlier. We sent all of these here. Ethan nodded. Most of them. Victoria looked around. And you kept every important one. The useful ones. She smiled faintly. Turns out that was almost all of them. Outside, the sun began disappearing beyond the horizon. The engineers had already started discussing solutions. Teams would review old designs. Production changes would be evaluated. Service recommendations would be updated. For the first time in months, people seemed focused on causes instead of symptoms. Sophie watched the conversations from the office doorway. So they finally believe you. Ethan looked toward the engineers studying the wall. They believe the evidence. Sophie smiled.
Same thing. Ethan laughed softly. Maybe she was right. As Victoria prepared to leave, she paused near the entrance. For a moment, she looked back at the garage she had ignored for a decade. The small building, the notebooks, the shelves filled with engines everyone else wanted to forget. Then she looked at Ethan. You turned our mistakes into knowledge. Ethan glanced around the room. I just paid attention. Victoria shook her head. No. She looked at the wall one last time. You did something most people never do. Ethan waited. Victoria smiled. You listened. Several months later, the crisis that once threatened Hayes Power Systems had largely stabilized. Engineering teams implemented changes. Service programs were updated. Long overlooked issues were finally addressed.
The company survived, but not without cost. Expansion plans slowed. Leadership priorities shifted. Entire departments learned difficult lessons about assumptions, data, and the danger of ignoring small warnings. Through all of it, one thing remained constant. Every Thursday morning, a transport truck still arrived at Walker Engine Repair. Sophie noticed it first. She stood near the office window watching another shipment being unloaded. They still send them. Ethan looked toward the crate. Looks that way. Sophie smiled. That is kind of funny. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Why? Because now everybody knows they are valuable. He laughed quietly. She had a point. What once arrived as unwanted scrap
was now treated very differently. Engineers occasionally visited the garage. Technical specialists reviewed older engines preserved in storage. Researchers requested access to Ethan's notebooks. The same materials people had ignored for years had become some of the most valuable technical records in the company. One afternoon, Victoria returned to the garage for a final visit before attending an industry conference. She found Ethan working in the service bay exactly as he always had. No larger office, no executive title, no dramatic changes. "I thought by now you would have expanded," she said. Ethan looked up from the engine on the stand. "Why?" Victoria smiled. "Most people would have." Ethan glanced around the garage. Customers waited in the office. Sophie finished homework at her desk. The familiar shelves remained full of engines and notebooks. "I like it here." Victoria nodded. Somehow that answer did not surprise her. Before leaving, she stopped near the wall that had changed everything. Most of the notes remained exactly where they had been months earlier. 10 years of patience. 10 years of attention. 10 years of listening. "You know," she said, "for a long time I thought we were sending garbage here." Ethan smiled faintly. "A lot of people did." Victoria looked toward the shelves. "Turns out we were sending information." Ethan nodded. "That is usually what mistakes are." The words stayed with her. Information. Not failure, not waste. Information waiting for somebody willing to learn from it. That evening, after the garage closed, Sophie helped Ethan organize a few notebooks inside the storage cabinet. The collection had grown so large that an additional shelf had recently been installed. She placed the final notebook into position and stepped back. "Do you think you will ever stop writing these?" she asked. Ethan considered the question. Then he smiled. "Probably not." Sophie laughed. "Good." "Why?" She looked around the garage, at the engines, the shelves, the notebooks. The years of work that had quietly changed lives without anyone noticing. "Because someday, somebody might need the answer again." Ethan closed the cabinet door and switched off the lights. Together they walked toward the parking lot beneath the fading evening sky. Behind them stood a small garage most people would have driven past without a second glance. Yet inside that ordinary building rested proof of something important.
The world had spent 10 years throwing away what it did not understand. One quiet single father had spent those same 10 years paying attention. And in the end, that made all the difference.